I'm all ready if you are. Welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War History with Tony. We are into the year of 1862. Uh, Last week, or 2 weeks ago, actually, we looked at the events surrounding the kind of aftermath of McClellan's failed Peninsular campaign. Remember, he had this big, elaborate campaign where he's moving this huge army up the James River Peninsula towards Richmond. And it took so long to get up there that the Confederates were able to basically bring more troops in and basically hold him off. The downside to the Confederate Army was that the general, Joe Johnston, who had been in charge of the Confederate Army in the East, was severely wounded and was out of combat for a year. So that marked the first appearance of Robert E. Lee as a combat general. Up to this point in the war, for about a year, little bit more than a year, he had been merely a desk general in charge of kind of advising the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, as to what should be done. But now he actually takes the field. And this is where Robert E. Lee becomes the big hero of the South, in a sense, along with Stonewall Jackson. But anyway, they end up chasing McClellan back down the James River Peninsula in a series of battles that becomes known as the Battle of the 7 Days. There was actually 5 battles fought over a 7 day period, and just completely humiliates McClellan's army, even though McClellan has him vastly outnumbered. Um, in the aftermath of that, Lincoln traveled to uh, McClellan's headquarters on the James River and just was shaking his head, didn't know what to do. He had this huge army that was obviously clearly capable of winning the battles. And because of his innate caution, because of his probably his desire not to be, lose respect, he ends up really just not being a fighting general. So he goes back to Washington, Lincoln does, and he makes two major changes. First of all, he brings Henry Halleck, who's been in charge of the West, back east to Washington and places him in charge of the whole entire Union Army. Remember, Cleveland had held that position for a little bit, but then Lincoln had taken it away from him, told him he wanted him to concentrate purely on being the head of the Army of the Potomac. And then he makes another change. He creates a whole brand new army out of the remnants of this army that had been fighting Stonewall Jackson over in the Shenandoah Valley. And he makes a whole brand new army called the Army of Virginia. And he places a man by the name of John Pope in charge of it. Pope is kind of a subordinate of Halleck's, and Halleck is really, uh, you know, up on John Pope. He thinks he's great. Well, what happens to Lee and McClellan? Well, first of all, Lee realizes that McClellan is sitting back in Virginia, just licking his wounds. He thinks, I'm not scared of this guy at all. He's not going to do anything. So Lee decides to go on the offensive. Now, remember, up to this point, the Confederacy had had the philosophy of being on the defense and basically playing not to lose. They figured as long as they held out, that eventually the Union would give in and they would become, recognized as their own country. Well, Lee thinks that that time has passed. He thinks now it's time that we have to go on the offense. And he thinks with McClellan's army sitting south of him on the James River Peninsula, that that is the ideal time to do that. So he decides he's going to move up once again towards Washington, D.C., along with Stonewall Jackson's army and James Longstreet. We haven't talked much about Longstreet yet, but he becomes a really important player in the rest of the Civil War. In the aftermath of the battle, Lincoln reluctantly reinstalls McClellan as commander of the newly reorganized Army at Potomac. Because remember, uh, what happens is the Battle of Bull Run ends up occurring, and Pope is just absolutely annihilated. It's a repeat of the first Battle of Bull Run. And so, he sends Pope packing, and he reluctantly has to reinstate McClellan as the Army of the Potomac, and he brings the remnants of the Army of Virginia in, and he creates this huge army. And he tells McClellan, hey, basically, this is your last chance. You have got to do what I want you to do, which is fight. And so at this point, uh, we're setting the stage for another huge battle. And so Lee is marching after the Battle of Bull Run. He's marching northward into Maryland. And, you know, basically McClellan is sitting in Washington trying to figure out where he's going because Lee is kind of pulling some shenanigans here and he doesn't know exactly where he's going. So that sets the stage for Lee's Maryland campaign. So after the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee, confident that McClellan's not going to do anything, decides he's going to move north. What he wants to do is raid into Maryland. Remember, Maryland is one of the 4 border states. Now, Missouri has basically already been lost to the south after Pea Ridge and the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Kentucky is still up in the air. Maryland is still up in the air. Delaware was never really in play. Those were the 4 border states. So he decides he's going to make a run up into Maryland, trying to sway that state to leave the Union and join the Confederacy, which would basically have surrounded Washington, D.C. with Confederate territory. Now, he knew it was risky because there's 2 things going to happen. Number one, every mile he moves north, he is leaving behind his supply lines and lething them. Number 2, he can't take with him everything he needs, particularly food. So what he does is he makes a really risky move and he splits his army up into 5 separate little armies. And he sends out notes. He sends out an order to each one of these armies saying, this is where I want you to go. And we're all going to come together at a certain place up here. And so he splits his army, making it harder to find, and also so they can live off the land. Now, that probably really could have worked, except for 2 things. Number one, McClellan apparently got the message, at least momentarily, because he absolutely whips his army back up into shape. Now, McClellan's a genius at that. McClellan might not want to fight, but he knows how to build an army. And he reconstructs this Army of the Potomac in a matter of days, not months, as Lee would have thought it was going to take. And on top of that, he has the break that probably could have won the Civil War in the middle of 1862. Here's what happens. September 13th, Lee and his 4 other little armies are all separated, marching up into Maryland. And they've all got assigned places where to go and where they're all going to come together. And he had issued something called Special Order Number 191, where he outlined what he wanted to do. Of course, obviously, that was a secret. He didn't want that to be found out. What happened was, and nobody to this day knows exactly how it occurred, one of the a Union corporal was sitting under a tree taking a break when he looked down and he noticed that there was some cigars wrapped in a piece of paper. And he thought, well, that's cool, because, he wanted cigars. So he takes the package up and he unwraps the thing and starts smoking one of the cigars and looks down and he realizes what he has in his hand. He has a copy of the Special Order Number 191. And so he's thinking, boy, I got to get this to the, general staff. So he makes a quick dash back to headquarters and he presents it to his commanding officer who takes it to McClellan. And McClellan opens it up and he realizes he has a treasure map in his hand. He knows exactly where Lee is going, where his other armies are, that they've split off, and he knows where they're going to reconstitute. And he makes the exclamation to one of his subordinates, said, if I can't whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home. He knows that he has Lee defeated at that point because, he's got like 80,000 men. And Lee's army at this point, his separate one of the 5 parts of it is only 18,000. Even McClellan can't mess this up. Well, guess what? You can't. Okay. So anyway, he takes off north, headed to where he knows Lee is going to be. And that's a little village at Sharpsburg, Maryland on Antietam Creek. And that sets the stage for the Battle of Antietam, which is one of the biggest battles of the Civil War and which really probably other than maybe the Battle of Gettysburg, maybe was one of the most significant battles of the whole Civil War. He had the real opportunity to destroy Robert E. Lee's army, break the Confederacy, win the war. Instead, his caution and his paranoia takes hold, and he wastes 2 days when he gets to Sharpsburg waiting for Lee and finds him. He wastes 2 days. Instead of attacking Lee immediately, he wants to make sure his army is ready. What that does is enable Lee to get messages out to his other four little armies that are all marching separately to come together immediately at Sharpsburg, because he's going to be, he's under great duress from this huge army of the Union. So here's the scene. Okay, this is Washington, D.C. This is the Shenandoah Valley where Jackson had his great campaign. This is Harper's Ferry and the Potomac River. And here is the Shenandoah River. Sharpsburg is probably 20 miles north of Harper's Ferry, probably maybe 70 miles from Washington, D.C., located on a little creek called Antietam Creek. And on September 17th, one of the hugest battles of the Civil War takes place, the Battle of Antietam. So it breaks out on September 17th. By that time, Lee's army had pretty much come back together. Like I said, McClellan has wasted 2 days. He could have attacked Lee immediately and just destroyed his army, but he doesn't do it. Now, McClellan has some supporting generals under him: Ambrose Burnside, which we're going to hear more about in a few minutes, Joe Hooker, which we're going to hear about, next week, and Lee has brought General Jackson and Longstreet's armies back together. So now they have a huge battle that's going to take place, and it is a ferocious battle, folks. And even though the rebel army is outnumbered, even with all the army back together, they fight with a ferocity that hasn't been seen in a long time. The battle would go down as the bloodiest day in American history. Places like Bloody Lane, the Sunken Road, Burnside's Bridge were just absolute scenes of slaughter. Longstreet would later describe the ebb and flow of the terrific slaughter on Bloody Lane. He said it was like shooting, bayoneting, onrushing, backward receding, grappling, flaming infantry clashes to a rope held in a rushing current swaying back and forth. He said it was just like every minute the battle shifted from one to the other, and nobody really could gain the momentum. Finally, McClellan's army overwhelms Lee's army. I mean, he's got them outnumbered, like, hugely. But then he once again becomes McClellan. He once again fails to order the final charge into the beaten rebel lines, even though, get this, folks, he had 33,000 troops in reserve, which never fired a shot in the battle. 33,000 troops sitting back in reserve, which he could have brought up. He could have destroyed the whole Confederate army, Lee's army, Jackson, Longstreet. He could have destroyed them. But for whatever reason, he held back. Some people actually still to this day, there are historians that believe that McClellan did not want to win the war. McClellan was so wanting to basically have a problem so he could become president in 1864. And sure enough, folks, he does run for president against Lincoln in 1864. The next day, Lincoln kept his whipped army on the battlefield, even though they were defeated, even though they were outnumbered, even though McClellan had this huge reserve army sitting back there. Lee basically just kept his army on the battlefield and looked at him like, come on, attack me if you dare. And McClellan would not do it. Finally, the next day, Lee's army, totally defeated, but still ready to do battle, limps off the battlefield, and McClellan's army just basically sits there and watches them leave, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. It could have been an overwhelming victory for the Union, but instead, it's kind of like a draw. you know, they declare victory, but because Lee's army leaves, but it's really not that much of a victory. This is kind of a crude map. Shows you Harper's Ferry here, little town of Sharpsburg. Up here is basically the battles going on. Down here, you got Burnside and Porter and Hooker over here. You got Stewart, the cavalry officer, and Jackson, Longstreet, Lee back here. And this is basically kind of how the battle takes place. This is a photograph that was taken after the battle, one of these aftermath photos. And this is taken of something called Bloody Lane. It was also called the Sunken Road. You can see that it was road that kind of eroded, and it was used as kind of a makeshift trench by some of the soldiers. These are basically Confederate soldiers that are lying dead. So listen to this, folks. This is from a diary that was taken from a Union soldier, and he published it later. There's a lot of these out there. But I thought this was such an interesting story. This is a story from the Battle of Antietam that a Union soldier witnessed and wrote about. He said, a strong, sturdy-looking Reb was coming laboriously on with a Yank of no small proportions perched on his shoulders. Wonderingly, I joined the group surrounding and accompanying them at every step, and then I learned why all this is special demonstration. Why the Union soldiers cheered and cheered again this Confederate soldier, not because of the fact alone that he brought into the hospital a sorely wounded Federal soldier who probably must have died from hemorrhage had he been left on the field, but from the fact that palpable at a glance that the Confederate too was wounded. He was totally blind. So you've got this Confederate soldier with a Union soldier on his shoulders walking to a field hospital into the Union lines. The Confederate soldier is blind. He was totally blind. A Yankee bullet had passed directly across and destroyed both his eyes, and the light for him had gone out forever. But on he marched, with his brother in misery perched on his sturdy shoulders. He would accept no assistance until his partner announced to him that they had reached their goal, the field hospital. It appears that they had laid close together on the field, and after the roar of battle had been succeeded by that painfully intense silence that hangs over a hard, contested battlefield, where the issue is yet in doubt and where a single rifle shot on the skirmish line falls on your ear like the crack of 1,000 cannon. The groans of the wounded Yank reached the alert ears of his sightless Confederate neighbor, who called to him the nature and extent of his wounds. On learning the serious nature of them, he said, now, Yank, I can't see, or I'd get out here mighty lively. Some darn Yank has shot away my eyes, but I feel as strong otherwise as ever. If you think you can get on my back and do the seeing, I will do the walking, and we'll sail into some hospital where we can both receive surgical treatment. We assisted the Yank to alight from his rebel war horse, and you can rest assured that loud and imperative call was made for the surgeons to give not only the Yank, but his noble Confederate partner immediate and careful attention. J.O. Smith. That's just a story from the Civil War. I read this and I thought that is such a really interesting story. And folks, this kind of thing happened all the time in the Civil War. They fought each other like absolute demons, and yet it wasn't out of hatred. It was for love of what they felt was the right thing to do. And here was an example of where when they were both disabled, they came together and they, made their way to a hospital. And this happened all the time, that hospitals would treat both the Yankees and the Confederates. That was nothing unusual. So what happened as a result of the aftermath of Antietam? Well, the Battle of Antietam was declared a strategic victory for the Union. It really wasn't much of a victory. It could have been so much more. It could have been a total annihilation of the rebel army under Lee, but it wasn't. But Lincoln needed a victory. You think back, he had not had very many victories other than Grant out in the West, and he needed a victory really bad. And so they proclaimed victory, even though it wasn't much of one, okay? was important as an aftermath of the Battle of Antietam was that Lincoln had decided to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. We're going to hear more about that when we get into 1863, because that opens up the year 1863. But basically, what the Emancipation Proclamation did was free the slaves in the areas that were still at war with the Union. It did not free all the slaves. That's a misconception. It only freed the slaves in the rebellious areas. Any area that was not in rebellion, or any area that had been basically taken over by the Union, like Missouri, the slaves were not yet freed. That would come a little bit later. Okay. Antietam ended up being, folks, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Listen to this. I didn't realize this statistic till I did some research on this. More troops were killed, 3,675, and wounded over 17,000 than the wars of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Spanish-American War combined. This one-day battle had more casualties than 3 of the small wars in the 19th century. That's an unbelievable statistic to me. I mean, it must have been just a horrific battle. It destroyed Lee's chance of bringing Maryland into the Confederacy. So, Maryland is lost at this point. He makes a few other efforts, but it's basically lost. On top of that, as you're going to see, out in the West, a man by the name of General Braxton Bragg was trying to do the same thing in Kentucky. He was trying to pose a raid up into Kentucky, hoping he could bring it into the Confederacy. It was called the Heartland Campaign, and he also gets beat. So almost simultaneously. So these two things together were a real crushing blow to the Confederate Army. It could have been so much worse than what it was. But as it turned out, it was a pretty bad situation for them anyway. On top of that, England and France, which they had never really warmed to the Confederacy in the first place, because frankly, they were so anti-slavery that it was hard for them to imagine going in league with a country that was trying to basically keep their slaves. On the other hand, they didn't much care for the United States because of obvious problems there. France had been kind of defeated by the United States in the Napoleonic Wars, or by Britain, and America had kind of seized some lands there, got the Louisiana Territory and all. And then England, of course, was still smarting from not only the Revolutionary War, but the War of 1812. So neither one had any love in their hearts at that point for the Union, but they most assuredly did not care much for the Confederacy either. They were toying with the idea of supporting the Confederacy, but after this, it was a lukewarm, basically feeling. Lincoln and Halleck prodded McClellan to go after Lee. They said, "You should have already destroyed him. Go after him now. He's on the run. You've defeated him. You've driven him off the battlefield. Even though you took your sweet time and didn't destroy him when you could have, go after him." But McClellan, again, he stalls. Nobody knows exactly what was going on in his head. Like I said, some historians actually believe he was wanting to set the stage where things would be so bad in the United States that he would be able to take over the presidency in 1864. But he doesn't make his move. It takes Lee one day to cross the Potomac River after Antietam. It takes McClellan 6. Well, Lincoln's had it. Lincoln, he's issued him orders. He said, "Go. I want you to go after him." And McClellan just stalled. And Lincoln finally had enough. He said, "I've toyed with this guy for practically 2 years, and he's done nothing but frustrate me." And here was what he said of him. He announced to his cabinet, he says that he's an auger too dull to bore with. In other words, he's got a bit and it's so dull he can't drill a hole with it. So, I'm done with him. And he basically sends him packing. He tells McClellan, "You're out. You're gone. I'm not going to have anything more to do with you." He replaces him with Ambrose Burnside, who is one of McClellan's subordinates. Now, Burnside, to his credit, realized he probably wasn't competent enough to command the Army of the Potomac. He told uh, basically Lincoln's aides that. He said, I'm not really ready for this. I'm not prepared to do this. And they basically said, well, if you don't do it, we're going to give it to your fellow subordinate commander fighting Joe Hooker. Burnside and Hooker were so hated each other so badly that Burnside could not fathom the thought of letting Hooker take over the army. So he reluctantly agrees to take over his command of the Army of the Potomac. As you can imagine, this doesn't go well in the long side for Burnside. Now, McClellan, to quote, Dylan Thomas, he does not go gentle into that good night. He vents his anger at Lincoln. He's upset with him. He says, you didn't give me credit for my accomplishments. I was trying to do the right thing. What he's actually doing, folks, is setting the stage to run for president in 1864. And sure enough, he does become the Copperheads. That's what they call the anti-war Democrats in the North, Copperhead. He set the stage and runs for the presidency on the Democratic Party. Was in a really good position to win. Had it not been for Sherman's taking Atlanta, he may have won the battle. He may have won won the presidential election in 1864. But Lincoln gets a good break. Sherman defeats the Southern Army at Atlanta, and it's a gigantic win. So anyway, that sets the stage. Let's look at Ambrose Burnside. He is now in charge of the Union Army in Virginia. Now, this is a picture of Ambrose Burnside. Burnside was a good guy. He was not, a real fighting general. He knew that. He knew that he probably didn't have any business being in charge of the Army of the Potomac. He was a middling soldier, graduated halfway in his class in 1847 at West Point. He really didn't have much combat experience. He actually resigned from the military in 1853 because he didn't want to fight Indians anymore. What little he was doing fighting. He rejoined the Union Army when it broke out and spent most of his first year in blockade in North Carolina. He was kind of in charge of the blockade in North Carolina. And he really didn't do much. He was just kind of there. He does eventually get promoted to Major General, becomes part of one of the Army of the Potomac subordinate staff. And he becomes a pretty good friend of McClellan's. They're not, best buds by any means at all, but, he gets along with McClellan. Burnside apparently was a pretty humble man from what I've been able to read. Everybody liked him. Everybody thought he was just really a good guy. They just didn't think he was ready for combat command. One of his officers said, few officers have risen so high upon so slight a foundation. In other words, he just wasn't competent. He was a good guy. He was a good soldier. He would do what he was ordered to do. He just didn't have the tools in the tool belt to get the job done. Probably Burnside is known for anything more than anything else for his sideburns. He was balding, as you can tell. And so at a time when it was kind of the thing to have a big head of hair, he decides he's going to basically grow a big, fantastic set of, whiskers. And it's kind of set at the double parabola from in front of his ears, down over his jaws and across his mouth. They were so unique. Nobody else had anything quite like this. But they started calling them sideburns. And that's where the term sideburns come from Ambrose Burnside and his beard, if you've ever wondered. A little bit of trivia there for you guys. So what happens next? Well, Burnside's in charge of the army now. And so he is ordered by Lincoln, I want you to go after Lee. I want you to find him and I want you to whip him. Now, surely Burnside must have learned something from watching McClellan and his dawdling ways, and he knew what was expected of him. So he prepares to go on the march and goes and takes the offensive. Here's the problem. He wasn't capable of doing this. And frankly, his soldiers were probably not ready. They had fought so hard for so long at the Battle of Antietam and been, devastated, even though they won the battle technically, that they probably weren't ready to fight again. But he is not going to take a chance. Lincoln has told him to go find Lee and fight him and attack him, and so that's what he's going to do. So he moves rapidly south towards the Rappahannock River with the obvious intent to attack Richmond. He's going on the offensive himself. And Lee's kind of shocked about this because he doesn't really think, he doesn't realize before it's too late that, there's a new sheriff in town. McClellan's out, Burnside's in, and Burnside's going on the offensive, and he's moving the army fast. The only thing that kept him from getting to Richmond was probably when he reached Fredericksburg in Virginia. He discovered the Rappahannock River was flooded. And even though they were supposed to have pontoon bridges waiting for him, they didn't show up in time. Halleck was, basically supposed to have pontoon bridges there. And so he gets to Fredericksburg and he can't cross the river for 5 days. That gives Lee time to bring his forces together at Fredericksburg to prepare to fight Burnside. And so they're sitting here staring at each other across the river because, frankly, the Confederacy has already burned all the bridges across the river because they knew what was coming. And so they burned the bridges. That's why they had to bring pontoon bridges in. So Burnside's army sits there for 5 days until they can get these pontoon bridges set up. And then they go on the attack, which was, frankly, folks, a very unwise decision. Number one, it's fought basically inside the city of Fredericksburg. You don't see this very much in the Civil War. Most Civil War battles are fought out in the open in the fields. This was one of the few instances of urban warfare in the Civil War. It also gave Lee's armies time to establish their defenses, to set up snipers in the buildings, and Burnside's army just went after Lee's army time and time again because Burnside was not going to make the mistake McClellan did. He was going to attack. The problem is he shouldn't have. This was a time when probably it would have been better had he not attacked, if McClellan would have been charged, because this was not a good idea. Ends up being just a horrible massacre, particularly the battle at what's called Mayor's Heights, outside the city of Fredericksburg, right on the edges, kind of the suburbs. Finally, he has to retreat back across the Rappahannock, and then he even tries another attempt in January, which ends up something called the Mud March because it's raining so bad. And by this time, the Union Army is just basically in tatters. It ends up being what Lincoln described as a perfect butchery. Lincoln responded, if there is a worse place than hell, I'm in it. General Lee would say of the battle, it is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it. It was just an absolute annihilation of the Union Army. After the opportunity to defeat Lee's army at Antietam, it turns around and Lee basically destroys Burnside's army at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And this is one of Lee's famous quotes. It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it. It was almost too easy. It was almost too much. And, I've never been in combat. I've never been a soldier. I admit that, folks. But I have talked to enough soldiers to know that it does become somewhat addictive to be in combat. It's scary, but the adrenaline flows so hard, and particularly if you're winning, that it does become almost, it's not something you'd like, but it's something that apparently almost becomes addictive, particularly if you're on the victorious side. And Lee was, and he was basically saying here, this is almost too much fun. And, it's a good thing war's hell because otherwise we'd like it too much. Horrific casualties, folks. Over 12,000 for the Union Army compared to only 5,000 for the Confederacy. Burnside, obviously, totally defeated. He wanted out. He knew he shouldn't have been doing this. And he basically told Lincoln, I'm done. I'm it. I'm sorry, I can't do this after all. And Lincoln probably felt the same way. So the next man up, kind of the old football lingo, if somebody gets hurt, it's next man up. Well, next man up. So now you've gone through McClellan, you've gone through Pope, you've gone through McClellan again, you've gone through Burnside, fifth man in charge of the Army of the Potomac fighting Joe Hooker. Now, he got a really good name and he had a lot of good things going for him, but as we'll find out, he wasn't much more successful than some of the non-fighters of the Civil War. Burnside is sent west. It seemed like once you get your rear end defeated in the east, they sent you west, and he sends him west to fight under Don Carlos Buell. Remember, Don Carlos Buell is partly in charge of the west along with Grant. And Lincoln thought, surely Burnside cannot give me any trouble out there. Surely, he's where he needs to be. Well, Burnside still causes him trouble, as you'll find out. It's a while, but he causes him trouble. This is a great photo. This is a picture taken on the Union side of the Rappahannock River, looking out into Fredericksburg. And these are Confederate troops sitting on the burnt bridge, the destroyed bridge, leading into the city. And just basically, they're just looking at each other. Basically, this is before the actual battle takes place. I love this. Look out here, folks. That's one of those logs that they painted black to make it look like a cannon. That's not a cannon. That's one of those Quaker cannons, as they called it. Basically, there to make the Union Army think they've got a cannon looking out the window. It's pretty obvious what it is. You don't have to have a lot of imagination there. This is from a description of the battle at Mayor's Height. This is the dead laying in the trench at Mayor's Height. This is basically Union soldiers. Confederate officer William Miller Owens described the Union assault on the Confederate forces entrenched at Mayor's Height as follows. The enemy, having deployed, now showed himself above the crest of the bridge and advanced in columns of brigades. And at once our guns began their deadly work with shell and solid shot. How beautifully they came on. Their bright bayonets glistening in the sunlight made the line look like a huge serpent of blue and steel. The very force of their onset leveled the broad fences bounding the small fields and gardens that interspersed the plain. We could see our shells bursting in their ranks, making great gaps. But on they came, as though they would go straight through and over us. Now we gave them canister, and that staggered them. A few more paces onward, and the Georgians in the road below us rose up and, glancing an instant along their rifle barrels, let loose a storm of lead into the faces of the advanced brigade. This was too much. The column hesitated and then, turning back, took refuge behind the bank. I don't think we sometimes appreciate the violence of war. Unless you've been there or unless you have had a loved one that's been there and suffered the ultimate, I don't think we can probably appreciate sometimes the violence associated with the war. Well, we're going to go next week and we're going to see what happens in the Western Theater, because while the Battle of Antietam is going on, the Battle of Second Bull Run, the Battle of Frederickstown is going on, Fredericksburg, there's also some events headed out in the West. But I'm going to stop today. We've been at this for about 40 minutes, so I'm going to halt today and hang on here. There we go. There we go. Okay. Hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. As always, keep up that lifelong learning. Do everything you can to keep that old noggin sharp, because that's what we need to do as seasoned individuals. I don't want to call myself old yet. I don't want to call myself mature, because I'm pretty immature at times. I'm seasoned. Okay. So anyway, I will let you guys go. We will see you next week, and we'll see what happens in the West.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.